Good afternoon, folks. It is Monday, and Mondays mean we are continuing with our series on biblical genres and an introduction essentially on how to interpret different genres of the Bible. One of the things that people get wrong about reading the Bible is that they don't know what they are reading. People are unfamiliar with the literature they're reading, so therefore that results in them misinterpreting the literature that they're reading, and that leads to them misapplying the literature that they're reading. So let me rephrase that. One of the mistakes that people make is not understanding the way in which God is speaking to them, which leads them to misapplying what God has said to them. So you can think of it in the sense of God's made certain promises to us as believers, and then so we look at the Bible and then we misunderstand or don't understand, and then that leads to us misapplying. So if God has said, for example, if you do such and such a thing, here's what the result is going to be. Say it's a punishment. And said that's in a certain part of the Bible where it is of the sort where it's not a universal sort of thing. It's very reliant on conditions and whether those conditions meet. And then you will have an uninformed individual taking this and then applying it to their modern Christian life and then thinking that they are going to be punished in a certain kind of way. And the Bible doesn't communicate that. So, probably the most dull genre of all the genres that we're going to be looking at. I think there's a subgenre of genealogies. And that's just a literary style, I guess, or literary type in regards to genealogies bore people to death. And they're very important. A lot of people do not know how to deal with law in the Bible. And law in the Bible is extremely important. And so we want to spend some time looking at law in the Bible, looking at some principles of interpretation, different kinds of law. What does it look like? I mean, what do you do when you and I come across people who are adamant about the fact, and there's quite a bit of people on the internet like this, that we still need to keep certain aspects, or that we need to keep all of, say, Old Testament law. And then Christian history generally has said, no, we don't need to, because that doesn't apply to us. So, as a precursor, and there's a reason why I've done these genres the way I've done them, and there's a reason why we did covenants last time, because one of the things that comes with covenants, certain covenants, not all covenants, is the genre of law. So if we want to think about covenants in this sense, if, say, the Abrahamic covenant is a covenant with Abraham about his descendants, and then we get what is considered to be, say, the Sinai covenant, which is a covenant with the people of Israel. So it's a group of people, and then it's a conditional sort of covenant, or it has conditional parts to it. The conditional parts to the covenant are supported by law and the genre of law. So it's very interesting that over the years I've had people come to me and say like, "Oh man, like I read Genesis and I read Exodus, and then I got to Leviticus." And then they got stuck in Leviticus. They got stuck in Deuteronomy. One of the things to mention about Old Testament law is that Old Testament law should be taken within the narrative of the Pentateuch or the Torah. Torah here meaning being a reference to the first 5 books of the Bible or the books of Moses. One of the best ways I've thought about, and again, this was taught to me, but one of the things that I've seen is viewing the first 2 books and the last 2 books of the Torah. So Genesis, Exodus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, viewing those 4 books through the lens of the middle book, Leviticus. The Levitical law is going to help you understand kind of what's going on in these sorts of things. Deuteronomy is second law, right? Like that's what that means. Like you got to be familiar with these things. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to jump into this. I'm going to give you guys a basic precursor of what law is, what are the different kinds of law, and then some principles of interpretation. So principles of interpretation in regards to law is going to be towards the end of this video. So stick around for that. And with that, hopefully you walk away having a higher appreciation for law in the Bible, but having a better understanding of how to interpret it. And then when you get into your apologetic conversations, maybe with people who are like, we need to keep law, like why is it that you eat certain kinds of animals? And or when we distinguish between like moral principles, say one of the things that's come up is in my conversations is, look, you're saying that this thing is morally wrong and people shouldn't do it, but doesn't the Bible say you shouldn't eat shellfish? I mean, I've heard that for the last 20 years. And at this point, it's sort of laughable because I'm like, you have no idea how to read law in the Bible. You don't know how to distinguish between, say, societal stuff, moral stuff. Like, it just doesn't exist. So therefore, yes, you are just going to repeat that and then think that you're making a very good argument when in reality, you're not. So, without taking more time as an introduction, we're going to jump into the genre of law. Again, as always, I'm going to give credit to where credit belongs. Biblical interpretation is a textbook you can get, and there's a workbook you can take. You can go through. This is a more seminary level, higher level reading textbook, and the link to these are in the description box. And if you purchase them with those links, then we get a little bit of money kickback our way because it's an affiliate link. And then the other book that we are using is How to Read the Bible for All It's Worth. Most of the stuff is out of this book, but also How to Read the Bible for All It's Worth. Both of those links in the description box. Let's get into it. Okay, so what is law, right? Like, this is one of the things that you want to do when you're reading and you don't know what you're reading. A very good thing to do is say, ask the what question. What is law? The reality is that there is no such thing as one sort of law. And we understand that. How do we understand that? Because in the modern world, we have exactly the same sort of stuff. If you are a lawyer, if you're learning to be a lawyer and all that stuff, you realize that it doesn't exist. Like, there's different, if you ask a lawyer, like, what kind of law do you practice? Because there is different kinds of law. And the Bible is no different than this. Like, ancient law is the same way. As a side reading, if you're very interested in law, and again, you should be, but as a side reading, you might want to pick up the Code of Hammurabi and read it. And then compare that to what you're reading in the Bible, because you're going to see a lot of differences. You're also going to see a lot of similarities between these two law forms from different societies. So here's 4 different kinds of law we see in the Bible. Okay, and so I'm going to give you categories and then subcategories and then like subcategories. It's just the way it works. So we have covenant code, which is something that we went over last time. And covenant code essentially is, here's the covenant, and then here's kind of how to keep that covenant, the codes that come with the covenant. Some of them are very elaborate. Some of them are not. They're very simple, but that's one. Deuteronomic code. So you look at Deuteronomy, and this is the essentially all 3 of these things have to do with the general populace interacting with God. Holiness code, how to keep holiness a thing. So as Christians, when we read this, maybe when we think about holiness, immediately our minds go towards kind of moral perfection. And I would say be careful not to do that, because maybe your mind should go towards like how to be separate how to be distinct from the people around you. And that's what would result in holiness. Some of those things cross over to each other in regards to moral holiness and also separation sort of holiness. We'll give some examples of this. And then there's the priestly code, specific law for priests, which only apply to the priests and not to the general population. And so, say, for example, like priests are not allowed to wear clothing made of two different materials, right? Like there's specific things for priests that they have to do, and that would be that. Let's look at the multiple usage of the word law in the Bible. So not only in the Old Testament, but in the Bible. The word law is used in many different ways in the Bible. Number one, there's the usage of it as in laws, multiple laws. That is in reference to more than the 600 plus laws the Israelites were to keep in obedience to God. So say Exodus 18:20 says, "And you shall warn them about the statutes and the laws, and make them know the way in which they must walk and what they must do." So these are multiple laws. There's many of them. Totality kind of, right? Like all-encompassing sort of conversation. Second, there is a singular use of law, and referencing to all the laws collectively. So Matthew 5:18, "For truly I say to you, until heaven and earth pass away, not an iota, not a dot will pass from the law until all is accomplished." More in totality, referenced as one thing. Number three, there's a singular use which refers to the Torah as in the book of the law. So Joshua 1:8, "This book of the law shall not depart from your mouth, but you shall meditate on it day and night, so that you may be careful to do according to all that is written in it. For then you will make your way prosperous, and then you will have good success." So this is, again, a reference to the book of the law. All right, so it's a singular thing, but it's a response or a reflection on a collective, right? But it's referred to as one. Number four, some writers of the New Testament use it in the singular to refer theologically to the entire Old Testament religious system. So 1 Corinthians 9:20, "To the Jews I become as a Jew in order to win Jews. To those under the law I become as one under the law, though not being myself under the law, that I might win those under the law." So this is a reference to the entire kind of Old Testament theological religious system. It's a theological reference to the religious system and all that it encompasses. That's another way that the word law is used. A fifth way the word law is used by some New Testament scholars is in the singular to refer to the Old Testament law. So it's like number two that we mentioned, but as it was interpreted by the rabbis. So it's talking about the interpretation rather than the actual thing. So Acts 10:28, "And he said to them, you yourselves know how unlawful it is for a Jew to associate with or to visit anyone of another nation. But God has shown me that I should not call any person common unclean." So this is kind of, so this is Peter speaking here, and Peter is referencing the system, right? It's talking about kind of what has been developed as a system as the rabbis have interpreted. And he says, this is unlawful. No, we are not to do this. Before we move on, in regards to what the purpose is, I want to read to these two main categories of law that you will notice. And so if you're taking notes, write this down. Causistic law, the way you're going to recognize this is an if-then statement. So you're going to see quite a bit of this in Leviticus, right? So for example, there's a condition and then there's a penalty. So here's an example. If men quarrel and one hits the other with a stone or with his fist, and he does not die, but is confined to a bed, so bedridden, that's the condition. So if people get in a fight and you hit someone with a stone, or you punch him and the person does not die and is confined to a bed, here's the penalty. This is out of Exodus 21, by the way, 18 to 19. The one who struck the blow will not be held responsible if the other gets up and walks around outside of his staff. However, he must pay the injured man for the loss of his time and see that he completes that he's completely healed. So he's responsible over the injury caused, and then, you know, he's got to take care of all that stuff. So you see quite a bit of this, and this is, again, we have laws like this in modern society. It is a way for the society, because now Israel is in a covenant with God, and that covenant with God involves human-to-human interactions and society functioning well, and the relationship between people being good. And when people do wrong things, what does that look like? What does justice look like? I think we're very familiar with this, and you recognize it. Again, if this happens, then you do this. If this happens, then you do this. That's the way these causistic laws work. Apodictic law is more of an absolute sense, right? Apodictic law is an absolute law. So this, most of the time, these have to be like moral parameters, and there's prohibitions. So, for example, Exodus 20, verse 13, you shall not murder. So one of the things you're going to get with apodictic law is you will not do this, or you shall not do this. You shall not do this. Do not do this, right? And usually with these absolute laws, the punishment is death. That's essentially what we're going to be seeing, okay? So what is the purpose of the law? That's a very important question for us to ask. What is the purpose of the law? Nowhere in the Old Testament does it state that people are saved by the keeping of the law. Like, this is not a salvation issue in that sense. I would hope that people would pay attention to and understand that the law is given to set Israel apart from the nations around them. That's one of the purposes, right? That predominantly the law is given to Israel to set them apart from the nations around them. And the law is given so that there's governance and normality, civility, you can say, in Israel. But again, remember, I said there's all these different kinds of laws. So the 2 we mentioned, but also the 4 we mentioned. Here's what I want you guys to walk away from this. Know that there are different kinds of law. You've already done like 50-60% of the work. If you are just self-aware that there are multiple kinds of law in the Bible and they ought to be treated differently, you've done a lot of work, because then you won't fall victim to treating them all the same. Right? That's very important. And quite a bit of this stuff has informed our modern legal system. That's another thing to know. So, actually make myself smaller here. There's these 2 other categories that we see, right? Civil laws and ritual laws. So civil laws, like I was mentioning, have to be the societal interactions. These are laws that specify penalties for various crimes, major and minor crimes. So if you kill someone, what happens? If you injure someone, what happens? If you are careless and your animal goes and destroys the property of your neighbor, what happens? What happens when your animal goes and kills your neighbor? Those are very important things to consider. So you might be arrested and tried in Israel because of these things, and then the punishments are whatever they say. Sometimes they're death, sometimes they're just legal fines, or carrying, like we read, like you got to make sure the person recovers. These are laws for people who live in ancient Israel. Again, these are laws for people who live in ancient Israel. which means they are not necessarily applicable to us. Again, we'll get to that. We'll get into regards to how do you interpret and apply some of these things. Because some people might say, well, these are laws for ancient Israel, so I don't need to read them, or what's the purpose of reading them? And there is a purpose for you to read them. Ritual laws. This is the largest section of law found in the Old Testament. Ritual laws. Usually these laws are found in the book of Leviticus. These laws focus on how the Israelites were to carry out Old Testament or Old Covenant worship. Detailing everything from the design of the implements of worship to the priest's responsibilities to what sort of animals should be sacrificed and how. If you've read the Bible for a considerable amount of time, and maybe you've gotten to these sections and you just haven't known what to do with it, you're going to recognize exactly what we're talking about here. It has to do with the religious system of Israel in relation to God. Okay, two principles, or two things about interpreting law. First, God intends it to serve as a paradigm of timeless ethical, moral, and theological principles. So, for example, the one we just read out of Exodus 21, 18 to 19, if two people fight and one hits him with a stone or with his fist and the guy gets injured, but he's not bedridden, he's able to move around and stuff like that, he's not to be held responsible. But he must pay a penalty for the loss of the person's time and see that he's completely healed. Essentially, his medical bills. So what do we learn from this? Well, depending who you are, like if you're reading this as a legislator in the United States government or any government, you might want to say, hey, well, that's a very interesting principle there in regards to fairness. Right? So you got to take care of the guy's medical bills because you're responsible for it. And whatever time is lost. So he was bedridden for 5 days or something like that. So you get a justice principle out of this. Again, some people might look at it and say, why would I need to read this? Because you will understand what justice would look like. And you will even understand what justice might look like in your interpersonal relationships with people. Suppose you've done something to hurt someone that's not necessarily of a legal status. It's just personal, you and him. I don't know. You took his lawnmower and broke it. Let's take that for example. You go to your neighbor and say, hey, can I borrow your lawnmower? And the guy gives you his lawnmower and you take it and break it. Like, as a Christian, how should you respond to that? So you can go to these things and look at it and, again, gain and learn some understanding of what it would look like for you to replace the lawnmower. Don't take his lawnmower back to him all broken and be like, hey, man, sorry, I broke it. I think it's pretty fair. Like, a good application of this text would be that you replace the man's lawnmower. That's a biblical application. You lose someone's book, replace the book. Don't just tell him you lost his book. So they're kind of timeless ethical and moral and theological principles that you will gain out of these things. That's the first kind of understanding in regards to interpreting Old Testament law. This is where people get hung up. People think, oh man, I can't apply this, so therefore, like, what's the point of interpreting it? Or you're going to see people who go like completely in a different direction where they're like, no, we have to keep these laws. And then they essentially become Judaizers to a certain extent and are now going around kind of forcing, like, if you're a real Christian, you will keep these laws. Like, no, you can keep the law in the way that, say, we were speaking about, the timeless ethical, moral, and theological principles. Number two, or second, to interpret law properly, the student must discover the timeless truth it conveys. So notice I mentioned the timeless truth here, and the timeless truth was justice. So justice is something where you can take in principle and apply in any society at any time. And so, look, we have questions like this we ask in our society, at least in America, like, what does restitution look like? What does restoration look like? Are we responsible as a society for mistakes the society has made in the past? Consider the conversation about slavery. How responsible are we for the poor in our society? Should we have a social safety net, say like a welfare system? The Bible has a social safety net for poor people. Yes, we should have a social safety net, but is it okay to just have like half your population on the welfare system? Let's just say. Well, no, because then that means people are probably abusing the system. It becomes a burden on the rest of the population. How can you get people out of poverty? Like, these are all questions we ask. And these are all questions that the laws in the Bible actually will inform you on if you interpret them properly and know how to take it and convey it into your modern context. And then say, here's what justice looks like. Here's what restitution look like. Here's, maybe there are crimes where like we're too lenient on and the Bible considers to, more seriously. And maybe what the problem is that our society needs to consider it more seriously. These are all ways you can interpret and understand biblical law properly instead of ignoring it, because one of the things I've seen continuously in my time in ministry is people ignoring it. And so generally you see two categories. Some people who completely ignore it, and then some people who like overdo it. They think like they got to keep every single one of these things. And that becomes kind of problematic. So principles of interpretation, or the principles of interpreting law. There's a number I want to give you guys here. Number one, or two I want to give you. Number one, investigate surrounding laws for interpretive clues. So you might read a law and then go, oh, like, I know what's going on here. I got to apply this without reading. So here's an example. It's always nice to give examples. I have very often had people come to me and say, doesn't the Bible teach that you should not be getting tattoos? I have two, and I'm not like my sleeves and stuff like that. I just have two pretty small tattoos, but I've heard it quite a bit. And then my response generally is, I don't know, does it? And it's not really because I don't know. It's because I want the people to think about it. Most of the time, people have no idea where it even says that. And generally, there are two things that come up. Number one, people go, well, doesn't the Bible say your body is the temple of the Holy Spirit? And I go, yes. If you look at the context there, it's talking about sex with prostitutes. And so you need to be aware of what that's talking about, because it talks about sins outside the body and inside the body and the dwelling of the Holy Spirit. So I explained the context there. So I go, that's not a good one. Give me another one. And then they would go, well, isn't it something in Leviticus that says you shouldn't mark your body and stuff like that? And I go, yes, that does say that. It says, do not mark up your body. Modern translations will tattoo your body. Or cut yourself, it says, for the dead. And I go, okay, what's the qualifier for the dead? Because that's an interpretive clue. There's a reason. Do not do this for the dead. Whatever that for the dead means. Most likely it has to do with like ancestor worship that the nations around them were doing, and saying, don't do it like the nations around you are doing. Like, do not be like them. It's like, cool. That's great. One of the other things I immediately, as a bearded man, I love doing is looking at the immediate context where that is. And as a matter of fact, if you go back and read a number of verses before, it speaks about not trimming the edges of your beard. And typically when the people that have come to me and asked me or told me that I shouldn't have tattoos because that's sin in the Bible are the cleanly shaven Baptist looking type. So I love you, my Baptist friends and brothers, but that's usually where the conversation is going to come from. And then I say, well, why is it that you do not have you do not have a beard? Like, where did that come from? If I'm going to apply this, then I got to apply that. So why aren't you doing that? Like, what gives you the reasoning that you're going to look at a part of this and go, I'm going to apply this part, but I'm not going to apply this other part, especially when they're so close together in that context. So we have to investigate the surrounding laws for interpretive clues. Number 2, understand the original meaning of the laws and consider the cultural background of ancient Israel. Like I said, I don't want to give another example here, but when it comes to the tattoos example, here's what I want to say. The qualifier for the dead says to me, maybe there's something I'm missing here. Suppose I'm just very uninformed when it comes to the Bible. And it goes, oh, for the dead. And I go, man, maybe there's something that these people were doing that I'm just not familiar with. So I need extra help, which means you might want to pick up a commentary. I would say probably a cultural background commentary. The IVP Bible background commentary of the Old Testament is a great resource. And you go read and you realize, oh man, these people had these practices, and what God is doing, it actually has more to do with idolatry and the worship of ancestors than tattooing. And so is there a modern correlation to that? And there might be. There might be a culture that, say, I don't know, braids their hair a certain way in worship to their ancestors. Then I would tell them, do not do that. Braiding your hair is not wrong, but braiding your hair in worship of your ancestors would be wrong. You guys understand the distinction here? And so these are the sorts of things, right? Like, do not, there's a Bible passage that speaks about not boiling it means cooking, right? A goat in its mother's milk. It's like, what do we do with that? Well, most likely that it probably had to do with some ritual meals that were connected to worshiping certain deities, and God says, don't do it. Like, don't cook your meal like this. So then when you understand the background information, and you have historians for this, and the cool thing is that we've actually found quite a bit of laws from the ancient Near Eastern societies. Like I said, go read the Code of Hammurabi, where it informs us and helps us in looking at biblical laws properly. The whole point of this, again, this is an introduction. I'm not going into all the fine details about the different sorts of laws we have in the Bible. That's not the point. That's not the goal of this. The point and goal of this is for you to have such an introduction, for at the very least to kind of enjoy reading law, for you to kind of stop when you are immediately challenged or think that I'm going to grab this and then start applying it in my life. And then pause and think and process, look at all the literature around it, say, okay, this is a specific sort of thing. Is it just for ancient Israel? Can I take principles and apply it? Like, all of these things matter. You're genuinely going to enjoy reading law more. And I don't know anybody who actually enjoys reading law, any kind of law, right? Like even modern law, like if you pick up a law book and you look at cases, it's not the best reading. And so I expect biblical law maybe not to be the best reading, but it's important reading. And you have to value it, because those things will impact the way you live your life. So I'm going to stop here. This is the lesson 3, the genre of law, a basic overview of what law looks like. And again, my heart and goal has been to encourage you to read law, to at least apply some of these principles, to understand cultural backgrounds and the things that surround the text, distinguish between different kinds of law, and then be able to develop yourself and become a better reading of the biblical text.